This infamous photograph of a young girl in clear distress is one of the most haunting images in true crime history. It's been plastered over the internet time and time again as viewers note the anguish in her eyes. Her name is Regina Walters, and she was just 14 years old when she was horrifically abducted and murdered by Robert Ben Rhoades, now best known as the truck stop killer. But how did Regina get into this situation, and who exactly was her killer? In this documentary, we aim to explore both of these questions, and more, as we take a look at the life and crimes of Robert Ben Rhoades. Welcome to Murderous Minds. In the early morning hours of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller was driving down Interstate 10 at the city limits of Casa Grande when something peculiar caught his eye. A Peterbilt truck, pointing towards the city of Tucson, had pulled into the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights flashing. Concerned that the truck had broken down and the driver required help, Mike pulled in behind the large vehicle and exited his patrol car. Shining his torch around the truck, he went to the back of the vehicle and illuminated the inside of the cab. He was shocked at what he saw, a terrified naked young woman screaming for help. Speaking about this incident later, Mike recalled, while at that particular time, when I shined the flashlight inside the vehicle, the woman screamed and I saw a momentary illumination of a man's face with the flashlight. That's when the series of events started, and there was no stopping any of the events that happened. Upon opening the cab door, Mike saw a man scramble through the curtains which separated the front seat from the sleeper. The man was ordered out by the officer and quickly identified as 44-year-old Robert Ben Rhoades, a long-haul truck driver from Texas. Rhoades put his hands against the truck and told Mike that he had a weapon. Mike later told the media, "It's the good guys who tell you they have a weapon." He was so smooth, yet that woman was terrified. "I didn't know what I had on my hands." Reportedly, Rhoades also claimed that the pair were consenting adults, but Mike didn't quite buy it. The trooper handcuffed Rhoades and placed him in his patrol car before returning to the frightened woman. He covered her up and told her that everything was going to be okay, that finally she was safe. The woman was identified as 27-year-old Kathleen Vine, and she had red welts on her body and cuts on her mouth. A horse bridle was strapped around her neck and a long chain padlocked to it. Her wrists and ankles were shackled to anchors that had been installed at either side of the cab. As Mike attempted to reassure Kathleen of her safety, Rhoades tried to make his escape, but was foiled by the trooper. Mike returned to his patrol car to find that Rhoades had been able to bring his handcuffed wrists from behind his body to in front of him, but he'd not yet managed to flee. Over Mike's shoulder, another patrol car pulled up. Rhoades was taken into custody while Kathleen was brought in for an interview after she'd been seen by medics. Kathleen explained to Casa Grande detective Rick Barnhart that she had met Rhoades at Rip Griffin truck stop just north of Phoenix. She said she often hitchhiked to visit her friends and that Rhoades had seemed like a very polite man. However, she had fallen asleep in his cab, and when she woke, she'd found he'd put her in his sleeper, shackled her and undressed her. Following this, Rhoades took torture tools from a briefcase and abused her on and off for the rest of the day until she was found. The red welts on her chest and back had come from a whipping she'd received from the 44-year-old man, and Kathleen told investigators that he told her his name was Whips and Chains. She had correctly assumed that this was CB radio nickname. Rhoades also told her chillingly that he'd been doing this for 15 years. Investigators asked Kathleen if she had been raped. She hesitated before saying that the police had arrived just in time. Meanwhile, the contents of Rhoades' briefcase were examined. The items were described as very well cared for, and everything was placed neatly. It contained chains, cords, whips, leashes, sex toys, alligator clips, pins and fishhooks. An FBI agent later assigned to the case recalled studying the contents of the case and noted, "Sexual sadists start off with a limited rape kit, as we call it. Because his was so refined, we knew he'd been doing this for a long time." Although authorities had already begun to believe what Rhoades had claimed, that he'd been abducting women and girls for over a decade, this helped to cement that idea. ABC News later described his truck as a travelling torture chamber. Rhoades, for his part, tried to dismiss Kathleen as a reliable witness. Unfortunately, the trucker wasn't entirely wrong. When rescued, Kathleen was reportedly wearing fuzzy lion slippers and ranting about secret prisons and being on a mission to save the president. Videotaped footage of her taken during this time is used by former FBI agent Bob Lee to train police detectives, who often believe Rhoades to be the more credible person in the situation. Still, investigators believed Kathleen and needed to prove that her story was correct. They managed to do so when the 27-year-old told them she'd bitten her attacker during the struggle, and sure enough, Rhoades sported a bite wound on his shoulder. Rhoades was extremely cool during his time with the police officers. He reportedly attempted to appear friendly and engage in banter with the investigators. But nobody was fooled by his act. He claimed that Kathleen was a lot lizard, a derogatory term used by truckers for women who frequented truck stops and traded sex for rides. After some time being interviewed by police, Rhoades was charged with aggravated assault, sexual assault, and unlawful imprisonment. Following this, Detective Barnhart decided to investigate Rhoades further to find out just who this man really was and if he'd struck before. Born in Council Bluffs, Iowa on November 22, 1945, Robert Ben Rhoades spent much of his childhood being raised alone by his mother, while his father, Ben, a soldier in the US Army, was stationed in West Germany. It's unclear where Rhoades grew up, but eventually his father returned home while Rhoades was still in primary school. Upon returning to the US, Ben Rhoades began working as a firefighter. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, a criminologist who was interviewed about Rhoades for a Sky documentary, stated that while Ben was away, Rhoades likely felt a longing for his father and a sense of connection to him. He may have even felt that his family was incomplete without his father around. However, when Ben returned home, things were not as picturesque as anyone would have liked. Ben was a violent man with a temper and was angry and aggressive towards the whole family, including his own son. Dr. Yardley states that it's likely that, at this point, Rhoades may have felt conflicted about his relationship with his father. Although little is known about Rhoades' childhood and family life, what we do know for certain is that his father was an abuser who held misogynistic views. He believed that girls and women were to be used and abused for men's pleasure and nothing more. Dr. Yardley has noted that this opinion of the opposite sex likely cemented itself in Rhoades' mind as a young boy. Rhoades showed no signs of trouble as a child, although he did reportedly have some unspecified social problems in his formative years. During school, he was an active participant in many extracurricular activities, including various sports, as well as choir and French club. Meanwhile, his criminal career was short-lived. Age 16 in 1961, Rhoades was arrested for tampering with a car, and a year later, he was arrested again for public fighting. Despite this, Rhoades managed to graduate from Thomas Jefferson High School in Council Bluffs in 1964, and following his entrance into the working world, he joined the Marine Corps. Later that same year, Rhoades was 18 years old. His father was arrested for molesting a 12-year-old girl. While awaiting trial, Ben killed himself. Criminologist Dr. Yardley said she believed that this action by Ben was the ultimate act of control. He decided to opt out of taking responsibility for his actions and leave the world on his own terms. There is some speculation that Ben's crime and his subsequent suicide were triggers for Rhoades, although his crimes would not begin for another 10 years. Between 1967 and 1968, Rhoades was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a robbery. Afterwards, he began to attend university, but quickly dropped out, before attempting to join the police force, where he was rejected, likely for his dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps. Between 1970 and the mid-1980s, Rhoades worked numerous jobs in stores, supermarkets, warehouses and restaurants. He also married 3 times and had 1 son with his first wife. His third wife, Debbie Davis, was still married to him at the time of his arrest in 1990. Debbie and Rhoades met in the early 80s at a bar called Chip Kickers. Rhoades at the time was dressed as a pilot, despite having never worked as a pilot in his life. He didn't even have a pilot's license. It was months before Debbie realized that she had been deceived, but she didn't end the relationship after she found out the truth. Rhoades is described as a cunning and charismatic man who was known to talk his way out of tough spots. He likely used his charm to win Debbie over after the truth was revealed about his job status. Later, after her husband was arrested, Debbie alleged that he had been verbally, physically and sexually abusive towards her. While the couple lived in Houston, Texas, Rhoades was an active participant in the BDSM scene and attended events for swingers. Notably, the BDSM community heavily emphasizes the use of boundaries and consent, but Rhoades appeared to have an interest in neither. One significant event to corroborate this notion is that one evening, Rhoades wished to attend a swingers party, but Debbie did not. Instead of understanding her boundaries, Rhoades claimed that there was something wrong with his wife and told her to loosen up. Dr. Yardley stated that this dismissal of his wife's consent and boundaries proved that he had no respect or love for her or other women. His only interest was in control and getting what he wanted. Upon speaking with law enforcement after his arrest, Debbie confessed that their sex life was not normal. She said she felt awful going along with the physically painful things that Rhoades enjoyed, but her self-esteem was so low that she was unable to implement her own boundaries and went along with her husband's ideas. Given the abusive nature of their relationship, it's likely that Debbie was also too afraid to say no to Rhoades. Rhoades was known to enjoy the suffering of people, and Debbie was no exception to this. According to the book The Evil That Men Do, written by former FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood, Rhoades once bought his wife a sex slave. The man apparently turned up at the door of their home, but was turned away by Debbie, who was understandably upset by the situation. In another instance, while his wife was in pain in the hospital, Rhoades climbed into her bed to have sex with her. Additionally, during the marriage, Rhoades frequently purchased hardcore pornography magazines and racked up massive phone bills from calling sex lines. One popular photograph of Rhoades online showed him dressed in leather and chains. Contrary to popular belief, he was not dressed to attend a BDSM party, but instead he was attending a Halloween party. He was dressed as a sex slave and had Debbie dressed as a dominatrix. She held onto Rhoades with a chain attached to his collar. In the late 1970s, Rhoades became a long-haul trucker, and in the summer of 1985, the company who employed him were based in Georgia, with an office along the I-95. As a result of his job, Rhoades regularly traversed 22 states. Examining his truck routes led investigators to identify more than 50 people who went missing during those years, and who met his victim profile. As a result, law enforcement has theorized that Rhoades is connected with all of these cases, although it may be that he is only connected with some or even none. Those who went missing at this time were often young runaways or people who were difficult to find credible, as witnesses such as drug users or sex workers. Tragically, they were the kind of people who had nobody to miss them. Following the arrest of Rhoades and a deep dive into his background, investigators began to suspect that the 44-year-old was responsible for many more crimes than he let on. Detective Barnhart approached the police department in Rhoades' hometown of Houston, Texas, and was made aware of another incident involving him and a young woman. 18-year-old Shanna Holtz was shackled in the back of Rhoades' truck and tortured and raped for 2 weeks following her meeting with the 44-year-old in February of 1990. Just 2 months before his arrest. Most reports of Shanna's story claim that he'd accidentally left her uncuffed. But an article written by GQ in 2012 corrects this by stating that Shanna had been left purposely uncuffed. Rhoades believed that he had instilled enough fear in her that he could leave her unattended while he left the truck. He told her to sit there and be a good girl. However, Shana knew that this might be her only chance for freedom, and she fled as soon as Rhoades vanished from her sight. Shana had been on the streets since she was 12 years old. According to her story, she'd been raped at least 20 times during that time and had already given birth to a child. While Rhoades thought he'd broken her down, he had instead fueled her resolve. The 18-year-old fled, a collar and chain still attached to her neck, and flagged down a passing driver for help. She managed to bring the police to Rhoades' truck, and he was successfully detained. But Shana was unable to bring herself to press charges, concerned that she wouldn't be believed. She stated, "I don't see any good in filing charges. It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence, I would charge files and sue him." It was later established that Shana was still terrified of the man, and this stopped her from attempting to bring him to justice. She also informed them that a woman claiming to be Rhoades' wife came by. This woman said that he had instructed her to clear out the apartment. On April 6th, FBI agents began sifting through the contents of the apartment, while others searched for Debbie. Inside the home, law enforcement found not just the things the manager had noted, but more, including bondage material, women's makeup, and a bunch of white towels, one of which was saturated with blood. Rhoades appeared to have an odd fondness for white towels. Both Shana and Kathleen had told detectives that he would put white towels underneath them before beginning the torture. The most interesting piece of evidence found in the apartment, however, were photographs and film rolls. It was here that authorities discovered numerous images of young girls and women in various states, most distressed and undressed, although one appeared to be squinting and smiling. One young girl in particular caught their attention. Her dark hair had been shaved close to her head, and photos showed it steadily growing longer, indicating she had been held captive by Rhoades for some time. Additionally, her body bore numerous bruises, which shifted colours as the footages went on. Then they found the photographs of this same young girl looking terrified in a wooden dilapidated barn. This was Regina K. Walters, a 14-year-old runaway from Pasadena, Texas. Regina Walters usually lived with her father, but at the time of her disappearance in February of 1990, she was living with her mother, Carolyn, in Pasadena. While Carolyn was at work, Regina ran away with her boyfriend, 18-year-old Ricky Lee Jones. It's unclear why, but Carolyn noted that the pair had fought a few days earlier. Upon returning home to find her missing, Carolyn called her daughter's friends and her father, but nobody had seen her. Regina hadn't left a note or a voicemail for either of her parents, which was most unlike her. Although she had a history of running away, the teenager always returned safe and sound and called to check in at home frequently. This time was different, however. Carolyn notified the police about her missing daughter immediately before she went out to hang up missing posters. She offered a reward for anyone with information that would bring Regina home, but it went unclaimed. Police officers in Pasadena who were searching for Regina thought that her boyfriend Ricky was involved in her disappearance, particularly as he had committed some minor crimes, including theft and vehicle theft, earlier in his life. Additionally, Ricky and his siblings had been removed from the family home by Child Protective Services when they were children, although it's unknown why. This, combined with his criminal history, suggested to law enforcement that he may have been a troubled individual. When Ricky's family were approached by the police for questioning, his sister Tammy was the only one at home. She told investigators that he'd been written off by the family, as they felt that he was a bad kid who'd end up in prison eventually. She noted that they hadn't seen him in a year and nobody had reported him missing. Speaking with Ricky's friends, however, authorities found that the 18-year-old was known to be meek. His friends also stated that he was infatuated with Regina, but was unaware that she was only 14. They also claimed that the pair had planned to run away to Mexico together, as Ricky had family in the city of Matamoros. FBI Special Agent Mark Young eventually took over Regina's case. While Pasadena police continued to theorize that Ricky was involved, Mark felt that Regina's disappearance was likely the work of somebody much older, probably a traveler with specific fetishes. 1 month after Regina vanished, her father received a phone call from an anonymous man at his home. Notably, his home phone number was unlisted and therefore was not publicly available in a phone book. The man told Regina's father, "I made some changes, I cut her hair." He also told him that his daughter was in a barn loft, but when asked if she was still alive, the caller hung up. The calls had been made over a 2-day period. The first was traced to Oklahoma City and the second to Ennis, Texas. It was later discovered that Rhoades had been refilling his truck in Oklahoma City on March 16th, the day of the first call, and the following day he had been in Ennis, thus connecting him to these phone calls. However, it was not established that Rhoades was involved until Regina's body was found by a state trooper off Interstate 70 in Bond County, Illinois, around September of 1990. A farmer who'd been planning to donate his old barn to firefighters was giving the decrepit location a final once-over before he gave them the okay to burn it down when he discovered the remains. Traces of white cotton fibre were found with the body, later found to be consistent with the towels found in Rhoades' apartment, although this evidence could not be used in court as the towels and fibres were so commonplace. Dental records proved that the remains were those of Regina Walters. Her father identified one of the photographs of her on Rhoades' film roll. Investigators realized that the photos of her in the wooden barn had been taken just moments before her death. Regina had been strangled using baling wire, and it was noted that an excessive amount of wire had been used, as it had been wound around Regina's neck 16 times. Sometime before her death, Rhoades had shaved off both the hair on her head and her pubic hair and had pierced her body with fishing hooks. On the day of her demise, he dressed her in a black dress and high heels, before photographing her in the barn and killing her. At this point, investigators also connected Rhoades to the phone calls that Regina's father received. They discovered that the 14-year-old had carried a small notebook with her that contained her father's unlisted phone number. Inside the notebook, Rhoades had written, "Ricky is a dead man." It had been scrawled next to a crudely drawn image of a gun and drops of blood. Ricky's partial remains were found on March 3, 1991 in Lamar County, Mississippi, but were not identified until July of 2008. Tragically, before Rhoades was linked to the case, Ricky was charged in absentia for Regina's murder. Although he is now in the clear, the fact that only partial remains of Ricky were found means that Rhoades had never been charged with the 18-year-old's murder, as there is insufficient evidence to bring charges. Detectives believe that Rhoades picked up the pair of hitchhikers in February of 1990 and killed Ricky while Regina slept, before disposing of his body. He then kept Regina for 2 weeks so that he could abuse her before murdering her in the barn and leaving her body behind. During the investigation into Rhoades' criminal behaviour, authorities established that his first known murders occurred in January of 1990. Patricia Candance Walsh, 24, and Douglas Scott Kowalski, 28, were newlyweds who left Seattle, Washington, in November of 1989. The couple planned to hitchhike to Georgia to attend a religious workshop, and reportedly on their way home, they got a ride from Rhoades near El Paso, Texas. But the couple never made it back, and their families promptly reported them missing. Much like in the case of Regina Walters and Ricky Jones, Rhoades is believed to have murdered Douglas first before disposing of his body. He then kept Patricia and tortured her for several days before finally killing her. Douglas's body was found in Sutton County, Texas, shortly after his death, but his remains were not identified until 1992. Deer hunters discovered Patricia's body near the mouth of a canyon in Millard County in October 1990. Her remains were identified in 2003. Rhoades was linked to the case by the bullets used to murder Douglas. It was established that the 28-year-old had been shot in the head using a Jennings J22 semi-automatic handgun with distinctive ammunition that was later recovered from Rhoades' apartment. After murdering Douglas and Patricia, Rhoades picked up Shana, who escaped, before picking up Regina and Ricky. Although these are his known victims along with Kathleen Vine, the FBI have estimated that he is responsible for killing as many as 1 to 3 people a month by the time of his arrest. During the FBI's raid of Rhoades' apartment, they discovered a photograph of a teenage girl in a grey hoodie with long inky black hair. They feared that she was another of his victims, and in 2015 her image was posted online as authorities asked her, or anyone who knew her and could identify her, to come forward. Their pleas for information worked, and the girl in the photo came forward. Pamela Milliken from Saskatchewan told investigators that she had been hitchhiking to find her brother in Winnipeg when she met Rhoades. She explained that he'd taken the picture when she climbed into the cab, and when she asked him why, he told her he took photographs of every hitchhiker he picked up, in case they stole something from him and fled. Pamela went on to explain, he told me he was going to Florida and he wanted me to come with him. At one point he pointed to a sign on his dashboard that said cash, grass or ass. No one rides for free. I didn't have any money, I didn't smoke pot, so I knew which one it would be. She claimed the two engaged in a consensual sexual encounter before he dropped her off at a Winnipeg bus depot. Thankfully, Pamela escaped from Rhoades unharmed, but she appears to be one of the lucky few. Although authorities have not been able to conclusively tie Rhoades to further disappearances, it seems likely that Patricia Waltz and Douglas Zyskowski were not his first victims. If Rhoades truly had been operating since 1975 as he claimed, then the FBI's estimate that he may have been responsible for the disappearances of over 50 people seems to not be so far-fetched. According to Detective Michael Sheely of the Illinois State Police, Robert Rhoades is one of the worst criminals he has ever come face to face with. Michael goes on to note that the only other time he saw Rhoades appear upset is in court, when he told the criminal that it was his pleasure to put him in jail for life. In 1994, Rhoades was convicted for the first-degree murder of Regina Walters. He was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. A year later, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the murders of Patricia and Douglas, but reportedly these charges were dropped at the request of the families, who didn't want to go through the emotional anguish of a lengthy trial. Rhoades was then later extradited to Texas for the murder of Regina Walters. Rhoades pleaded guilty in exchange for the prosecution dropping the death penalty. Rhoades is still serving his sentence in Menard Correctional Center. He is now 76 years old, and he will never be released from prison. In 2012, his ex-wife Debbie Davis lived in College Station, Texas, and dedicated her time to speaking on domestic violence at conferences and schools. She also reportedly continued to get letters from Rhoades for a while after his incarceration. Sometimes they were cajoling in nature, but others were threatening. Given the lack of information on Rhoades' upbringing and personal life, it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly made him become the serial slaying monster we know him as today. Of course, the most obvious answer is that he was abused by his father, and repeated the cycle when he became an adult himself. Statistics show that roughly a third, or between 30 and 40% of abuse victims, go on to become abusers themselves in adulthood. It also seems likely that his father's horrific views of the opposite sex had some impact on how Rhoades began to view them himself. It's clear from the accounts by his ex-wife, to the statements made by criminologists, to even Rhoades' own actions, that he took great pleasure in other people's pain. While we may never know what the trigger was for Rhoades, his love for others' suffering appears to be the true driving force behind his nightmarish actions. Robert Ben Rhoades may already have the blood of dozens of people on his hands, but he could have had far more if it wasn't for a chance encounter with Arizona State Trooper Mike Miller.